So yeah, thanks to Martin, thanks to Flutter NYC, thanks to VGV, thanks to Justin and Caitlin for fielding all of our hiring and recruiting questions that you might have. My name is Will, and I have been really happy to be part of the migration of our native Android and iOS apps to Flutter over the past, it's been, we started on this journey early 2020, almost 2 years now. We're now, I think, in a really positive place technically for it. It's been a really great journey to be a part of in terms of my own personal growth and the personal growth of a lot of our engineers. And so that's what I am hoping to talk about today, and hopefully give an idea of some of the things you have to think about when you're going through a full app migration to Flutter from 2 platforms to 1. And we're not completely done. I'll show you in the near the end where we are now, but we have really benefited from this so far. And the approach we've taken is to have an incremental migration. And I'm going to do that really annoying thing that people do when they're speaking, where they actually like ask people a question and then hope that people will respond. So like when either if it's something that Jeremy said or something that you can relate to in your experience, like why might an incremental migration make sense when you're doing something like Flutter? Because Google Pay, they did it all at once. Now I have 2 Google Pay apps on my phone. So why wouldn't we just do that? What is something that might be a good idea or a good reason to do an incremental migration as opposed to like a wholesale all at once? Anyone? Feel free to type it in chat or anything like that. Minimize risk. Yeah, totally. That's the first bullet point in the next slide. Yeah, not having 1 million engineers, or having 1 million engineers do the job of 2 million engineers. Another one. Yeah. Iterate to breakthrough is a Betterment. Yeah, testing and production and all. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. I got 4. That's awesome. So yeah, wholesale app rewrites. It's the complete polar opposite of shipping small. It's a risky transition for users and for your entire app. You basically limit your ability to roll back any changes that you might make if you're going to ship an entirely new app and experience to users. You can't feature flag, ship to small populations at a time. It might require cutting functionality. There are fewer opportunities to transition native devs to Flutter. It can be hard to transition on developers themselves. There's a whole bunch of stuff. It's for the same reason you don't want to ship any code big all at once. The same goes for a migration like this. And so what I want to talk about tonight is a couple things that get us to like how we made this whole Flutter migration work. I'm going to talk a bit about the technical aspects of how on Android and iOS the feature architecture and view architecture differs a little bit from the way that it works in Flutter, and how across our mobile platforms that means that we have a Flutter app embedded within a native app, and how that makes a full app replatforming possible, safe, and easy in a technical sense. So first, I wanted to. This is an abbreviated version of what the Betterment app looks like in terms of a kind of feature graph. And I put this here to kind of just show that it's not a small thing. The Google Pay app is 3 panes on like a single, like a little sliding thing. And for us, we've been working on this app for a long, long time. 2014, I think, is when we started, 2013 maybe, with the iOS app. And we have a whole lot of features that exist on both platforms, and page 1 of many. And this is the native thing that we have to migrate. And so first, in terms of the actual structures that we'll migrate, I think about it largely in terms of features. Mobile individual features make up a mobile app. And you have, of course, app-wide infrastructure, architecture. But when you're talking about a migration, you're really going to think about what are the individual experiences that we can ship and have a incremental, slow growth of a Flutter app within a native app. And so first, Android and iOS. Firstly, I'm kind of curious if people could. I'm curious about the experiences of people in here, whether people are native developers that turn into Flutter developers. Do people have experience with Android here? Yeah, a couple people. iOS? Yeah, okay, cool. Awesome. So yeah, Android and iOS, I'm gonna probably just use the word like view controllers. That's the iOS word for it. But essentially in iOS and Android, you have an application class that launches and then configures view controllers. View controllers are, I don't know exactly how to put it, but they manage views. They're not necessarily views themselves, but they manage memory, lifecycle, and the actual things that are drawn on a screen. So in Android, you'll have like activities and fragments. In iOS, you'll have UI navigation controllers, UI view controllers. These are the things that manage how you go. You can go from screen to screen, and then also the individual screens themselves, or even just a part of a screen. And this little icon that I have here, I'm going to try to trying to be clever with identifying like things like this with, that's like a native view. Features are made up of view controllers that manage views. And while this seems like a pretty trivial and obvious thing, I mention it, well, first actually I have this slide, which says kind of the way that an application might look or a feature might look is you kind of have, you start with, have an application kind of outside of a feature context, and maybe it's an individual class. And then I have these little things here that are kind of individual screens, and they are either on Android and iOS, and they manage views. You're going to see a whole bunch of things like this. I don't know, this is kind of just what felt natural in terms of depicting what it looks like to have going from screen to screen in an Android or iOS app. You're stacking view controllers on top of each other. And so when you go from screen to screen, you're actually putting things on top, and that's how it works in these view controllers. In Flutter, a lot of the stuff looks and feels kind of similar in Flutter, but there are also a bunch of things that are pretty different. In Flutter, you have a Flutter engine, which is a portable Dart runtime that hosts Flutter applications. It manages the actual drawing of the drawing on a Skia canvas. Everything is a widget in Flutter, and I put that here. That's actually a name of a great podcast. You should check it out. Everything is a widget. I have this little icon here that I refer to sometimes. That's the widget tree. In a widget tree, you have an app, you have navigators, you have individual features, you have texts, you have images, and they're all widgets. And I mentioned that because it's a little bit different than we have on Android and iOS, where we have view controllers that manage views, so that in Flutter, it's much more like all part of the same tree. You all are familiar with this. I'm preaching to the choir, I'm sure. And then you have a navigator. It is a widget. It mimics native navigation. And this is, the way that you might think of a pure Flutter app. You have an engine, and then the engine is it's involved in an app related to the widget tree. The widget tree is what's drawing all the stuff on a Skia canvas. So this is kind of where we're going with putting Flutter inside of a native app. You still have all of the native application. You're still going to have native view controllers, native experiences. And then what we have is the Flutter embedding libraries, which provide methods to embed Flutter as a view within a native view controller. And so the application will configure and keep an instance of like a Flutter engine, and then it will use that engine to create different views that are presented on in an actual native view controller. So yeah, in terms of actually embedding Flutter in native, yeah, like I said, native apps create a Flutter engine. We have stuff like Flutter view controller, Flutter activity, Flutter fragment from the embedding libraries, and the view controller itself will show the canvas that's drawn by the Flutter engine. And here we see that we can have Flutter embedded within a native view controller, and it's all connected with the fact that the application has a reference to an engine that creates and then provides to view controllers. So the way that it'll start is you have an application. I have a couple things of code here because it's like a technical talk. I have one in Android, one in iOS. I'm just showing the basic way that this might look in an actual application. In the Android context, you might have an application. Well, you definitely will have an application. You'll create an actual engine, and then you will you'll execute the Dart entry point that will run main.dart. And then you can cache an instance of the Flutter engine, put it in the Flutter engine cache. And then you can use this engine when you are going to actually put the Flutter views, Flutter view controller, et cetera, in a view controller. So at this point, we now have an application that has an instance of an engine. and it is ready to actually do some showing of some Flutter stuff. I am not an iOS engineer. We use like a coordinator pattern here, so I use that here. But basically, this is how it might look on iOS to actually do some creation of a view controller that has a reference to a Flutter engine. You would create a Flutter view controller, give it an engine, and then you just take some other view controller and present it on top. You can animate it. You can do all the normal stuff you do with normal view controllers. And then that's a view controller that has the Flutter drawing within it. And then you're pretty much at like the most basic form of Flutter embedding that you can have in a native application, which is an application has a Flutter engine, and then it's able to push a view controller on top of another one that is able to show whatever the Flutter engine is doing based on whatever you put in your like main.dart. So again, this is the thing that we are trying to migrate, and we're going to turn it into something like this, where instead of having native features, we're going to have native that's hosting a Flutter app, and the Flutter app is going to do all of the stuff that the native app was doing. So this, it looks like it's pretty much the same thing, but it's a completely different structure in terms of having one view controller that is hosting an application that is able to go between all of these different features versus having all these different view controllers that are working in the native frameworks that actually Flutter is mimicking internally. So just do the migration. How does it actually look? Firstly, I wanted to mention, wow, this subtitle is optional. Nice. Thanks, Google Slides, for telling me that. I thought that was one of those things that, is just, okay, you know what I'm talking about. Never mind. So our actual priorities, increment, by the way, that might happen a couple more times because I've seen that. Priorities, we want it to be incrementally shippable. It's kind of the whole point of the talk. We want it to be a seamless transition for users. This is actually, I think, really important. There was I saw on Twitter, Philips Hue put out a migration. I think that they have a really great app, but a lot of people were angry at the fact that it just logged them out. And even though that's something that they have to you have to log in once, it's a disruption, and it really makes people aware of the fact that they're entering a totally new thing sometimes, especially if you do a redesign, et cetera. But also, we want to use this opportunity to onboard new Flutter devs, as Jeremy mentioned earlier. We want to have a flexible approach that is feature flaggable. We want to make building individual features from native and from Flutter really easy. We want it to feel natural for developers. We want to have high user experience, or a good user experience, a good developer experience. And we want to optimize the thing that we will use to migrate. We want to optimize that for maintenance and deletion. We want to make it so that we can make changes if we want to about how animations work, or about how we're nesting features, et cetera. And then at the end, we want to be able to just get rid of the thing that was kind of our crutch the whole time. So how do you do that? This is the Strangler Fig pattern. It's named after an actual tree that exists called the Strangler Fig. It's an analogy, I don't know, metaphor that I think was named by Martin Fowler, who is a great blogger, talks about refactoring code, maintaining code, and specifically for big monolithic incremental legacy code replacement. The Strangler Fig is an actual tree that is parasitic. It starts at the edges. It plants seeds in the branches of a tree, and then it takes over a couple individual branches. It goes towards the sun, and then the roots start to travel down the trunk of the tree, and then it hits the ground, starts to get nutrients from the soil, and then it starts to wrap around the tree. It starts to take over more of the branches, and eventually the internal tree dies, and you have it's a totally new tree with the same exact shape of the old tree. And I love this metaphor because this is how it feels and this is how it works. It's great for large modular systems. And I think that as I start to give some of the examples, you'll realize this is a lot of what we do as software engineers all the time. You create abstractions that allow you to make changes in small places that bring you towards where you want the larger system to go. And there's, Martin also talks about the Strangler facade is kind of like that abstraction that allows you to choose between, I'm going to go to this branch, I'm going to go to the actual tree, or I'm going to go to like the Strangler Fig tree. And so at each, and I also like the tree metaphor because it's, widget tree, Flutter, et cetera. And it's not just it's not a trivial name kind of coincidence. Actually, different branches on our widget tree are the different branches that we're going to go down. And it's either going to be some widget that ends up pushing like a native feature or a widget that's just going to show all of the stuff in Flutter. So again, this is kind of the way that a feature might look. You start with, one view controller, you go to add another one, you add another one on top of that. And instead, what we might have in Flutter, if you want to be able to feature flag between going I'm going to have one native feature, I'm going to go to another one, or I'm going to have one native feature, view controller, and I'm going to add a view controller that hosts Flutter within it. And so here, what I'm doing is showing you that like this blue thing, that's like a navigator that's showing you a route. And that route is probably going to be a full screen, either feature or individual screen. And it's going to mimic what was being shown in the native context as much as possible. And before continuing, I just want to mention a couple of the things we think about in terms of when to, or what features to choose for a migration. With the Strangler Fig pattern, one of the really important things is to kind of try to start at the edges. Start at things that can work on their own. And when you migrate them, you don't have to worry about other dependencies that might, I don't know what the word would be, but things that depend on it. Yeah, other external dependencies. That way, when you make a migration, you can kind of say that thing works. Now I can think about the thing that depends on and migrate that. And so if you think about like the metaphor of the tree, like you start at the leaves, you start at the edges, and you actually go down each individual branches, and then eventually you're at the trunk, eventually you're at the ground. So it reduces overhead. It helps you optimize deletion to do it this way. And also, as Jeremy mentioned, it is really useful to actually think about what features am I going to migrate, take the opportunity to prepare your PMs or whoever for new feature development, explain to them what is going to be useful to do in what order, and put that on the roadmap. You can use individual, like small leaves of the tree are great opportunities for onboarding new people who are new to Flutter, or just Flutter engineers who are new to your code base or your product. And it's, as I'll mention later, really important to identify branches that can't be migrated. And then you have to deal with those, and you have to create a pattern or a structure that's going to be able to flexibly deal with those kinds of situations. So again, this is kind of how our app starts. We have all these yellow native features. And then we start at the branches. And oh, wow, look, we did a couple of different migrations. We might have one team that owns each one of these individually, maybe just a screen or maybe a flow of screens. And then you keep going. Eventually, as you start to work your way down each of the branches into kind of more of the core of the app, you get into a place where you only have a few things left. And those things are unfortunately usually the most complex things that you've put off for a while. And so you start from having this feature thing that I described earlier, and your view controllers and your features will look something like this. You'll have the same number of view controllers. You're either going to, when you migrate your first feature, you're either going to have like a view controller that you already had in your native app, or you're going to have one that's hosting your Flutter content. And then, in terms of the features, you'll see it's pretty much the same diagram, but showing that the view controller that's hosting Flutter now just has that one feature. And as you keep going, you move down the branches, like I showed you before. Then you're going to start having fewer and fewer view controllers because the tree of Flutter features is going to get larger and larger. So before we had like the leaf that we were launching from native, and now we're launching like the twig that has the leaf, and then you'll launch the branch that has the twig that has the leaf. And as you'll see in the features here, that's how it looks. Is like you only have 2 of these view controllers now. You're losing native complexity and you're putting it into Flutter. And as you continue, you end up having only just one view controller that has your entire Flutter app. And then the way that will look is you have these features that are just within Flutter. The engine's taking care of them, and you're going from screen to screen, route to route, all within one native view controller. And this is actually how just a Flutter app, even if it's not in add to app, like embedded mode with Android and iOS, this is how it actually works. But they take a lot of that stuff, and it's in like the git ignored files, whatever, stuff like that. So it's super easy. That was my talk. Actually, well, so one thing is strange here. That's weird. If I get rid of some of this other stuff, like, oh my God, that's so annoying. We have, this actually happened to us. This is kind of the current, one of the current states of our app. How will it work when you have going from native to Flutter to native to Flutter? In some cases, you won't be able to avoid this. We were not able to avoid this, and we're in some cases still in a position where we have to deal with this. I recommend if you have a product person that's saying like, couldn't we just do that? And it's like, you know, you could, but also you might like hate yourself at the end of the day for it. So what you would have to do here is, instead of having all of your features hosted within Flutter, if you're adding another feature onto the tree, then it's just part of the Flutter app. Instead, what you have to do is you have to figure out a way to add like another view controller on top of Flutter, which is just an entirely new structure that you're gonna have to figure out that's able to take any of your existing native features and then make them launchable from Flutter. I'm not gonna get too much into the details of that, because if you can figure out how to do it in one way, it's very similar conceptually to the opposite, but this is how it ends up looking. You have a view controller, you go to Flutter, crap, now we need to be able to transfer money. So we like go to the, you go to the native feature for that, but then like, oh my God, they want to be able to link a bank. And we did that in Flutter already. So now you go to Flutter again. And while this ideally is like really seamless for users, and you don't have that many problems with it in terms of, it's going to be a lot harder to maintain. And you're going to be really thankful for the days that you're able to get rid of that third one and just have Flutter taking care of most of what it does, instead of having external platform specific dependencies. And on top of all that, if you have multiple embeddings, proceed at your own risk, because this is not actually supported anymore in Flutter. We started our journey in a time where this was something that you could easily do. And then there were PRs that were merged into Flutter, and the embedding libraries that made it so that the Flutter engine, at least on Android, I'm familiar with that part. I think it was also an issue on iOS, where the Flutter engine is now only going to attach to one host component at a time. So there are Flutter endorsed workarounds that you can look to. I have a link here. I don't know if anyone's going to see these slides, but you can find a design doc that Flutter gave that helps you understand how to do this. This is not supported anymore because Flutter is moving in the direction of having smaller, lightweight Flutter engines that are able to be embedded in multiple parts of your app that won't share state because they're totally different runtimes. So this is something that was an intentional choice by Flutter. I also wanted to mention that there's one GitHub username that was extremely helpful to us, Exter, and I saw when I was reviewing a design doc that Exter wrote that there were some comments on it mentioning that he also, as a really great member of the community, has also passed away recently. So I just wanted to mention, thanks, Esther, for helping us figure this out and giving us some solutions. And yeah. The actual migration architecture. This is largely just been about the structure of the features so far, and the little details can get messy, as I mentioned. And one of the things that Martin Fowler will talk about in the Strangler Fig Pattern is it's useful for taking microservices and migrating them from like one implementation to another. So UX can be a microservice. We at Betterment have created like a feature class that can be extended and is kind of, and it creates a navigator. The navigator has full screen routes for it's either individual screens or other features. And these are kind of the building blocks of our Flutter application. So if you can take a feature and we've built a structure that allows you to be able to launch it from native, and then that same feature can be drawn and launched from Flutter as well. This is something that I think not only is really intuitive and helpful, but is a good reminder that you want to keep as much of the platform-specific stuff platform-specific as possible and have as much shared, the way that things will look at the end, you want to have them look in Flutter as soon as possible. So this has been a good choice that we have gone with, and these features can end up communicating results back to either the Flutter feature that they came from or the native feature that they came from. And here, again, is Navigator. It has multiple routes on it. This also might be a good time to mention that with this approach of having embedding Flutter within native, it has been really helpful to embrace a navigation architecture that mimics the way that native ends up doing navigation, which is having, in some cases, nested series of flows and navigation. I'm not sure what to describe it as, but yeah, essentially nested navigation in Flutter. It's not always what people like to do. They sometimes like to have routes that are able to be generated across the entire application. But for us, what we've decided is, in order to help us maintain that parity with our native application, it's really useful to be able to have the feature contain navigators. That navigator can have other features which have their own navigators, etc. Okay. So you just have Flutter build a feature, right? Yeah, the subtitle's optional. We want to display a feature, but if we just start a Flutter view controller, it's just going to draw an empty canvas, or it's going to draw whatever route you put in as the material, or in the app that you return or that you run from main.dart. For us, and I'll show you a diagram very soon about why that's just an empty canvas, because you want to be able to sometimes start feature A as the first Flutter feature, sometimes you want to start feature B as the first Flutter feature. So we can't just embed Flutter if we're going to embrace this thing where it starts in native and then you might be able to go to this Flutter feature, this Flutter feature. We need to give it instructions when we start a Flutter view controller about what it should be showing. So how can we do that? Platform channels, I might say method channels a couple times, like as if it's the same exact thing. Method channels are a popular form of a platform channel, but it's essentially a way to have native to Flutter communication. Here I have iOS and Android as like the orange and green. That was just part of the color scheme. I don't know. I know it's not really anyway, whatever. And they communicate over a platform channel. With a method channel, it would be native JSON able to communicate through binary over to Flutter JSON, and then a method channel on each side will be able to take and send information and start actions if you are hooking them up to actual navigators and features. So this is a very basic form of what it might look like to start a Flutter view controller and then tell it what to do. First, you start in native, and then for native developers, you know that what you need to do is you need to start, the first thing you can really do is pushing, excuse me, sorry. The first thing that we'll do here is we're going to talk to the method channel that's with Flutter, and we're going to give it some instructions about what feature it should be showing when we push the Flutter view controller. So by the time that we actually get to step 2 here, which is pushing that Flutter view controller, the Flutter engine is already aware of, this is the thing that I've been told to show. So you create some sort of structure that is able to connect a method channel to some place in your widget tree that has, reference to a context where it can find a navigator and then parse inputs about what feature it should be showing, and then push a route based on those inputs as a feature on a navigator. You're at step 2 here, and I'm doing my little feature stuff. I'm going to check my balances, etc. And now I want to go back to where I previously was. So you can first, well, in Flutter and in native, you're either popping like a route, and then in native, you're popping a view controller. So in Flutter, if you're going from Flutter to Flutter, you'll just pop a feature or pop a route, and then you'll be able to send results back through that pop. And so we'll do that the way that we would if we were just going from Flutter to Flutter. But then we also need to send information back from Flutter to native to say, hey, we just popped this Flutter feature. You should also pop this view controller that we're showing, so that it's not just a blank screen and people are wondering, if their app froze or whatever. And so you end up popping the feature. Now the navigator might have a base route that's like white or something like that, or it might just have, I think navigators can have empty routes, and they'll just show like a black screen if you ever end up there. And then the method channel also, you'd have to configure it to handle result if that's what you're going to do. A lot of features are going to behave that way. They say, this thing does this, and then I want to communicate that this did that. There are ways that you can make it really easy to communicate that depending on what state management system you're using in Flutter. But when you are embedding within native, you have to use platform channels to actually communicate that, because they don't share any of the same data or like system architecture. So one of the things you have to do is you have to build a smart Strangler facade. You have to create a system that's able to parse inputs. As we start at like this native thing, it can take in inputs and it can take in a name of a feature, et cetera. And then what we've done at Betterment, we've created like an embedded feature manager class that has a method channel. It takes in those inputs and then it creates what we call an embedded feature. An embedded feature is a class that we've made that is able to actually build a widget and then send that widget to a embedded root, a widget or a feature that is able to push that widget as a route on itself. And then the way that Flutter does, you're able to pop with data or pop with a result, and you can hook into that. You can await pushing the feature, and then when you're done with that await, then you will get the outputs back to the embedded feature that you started with. The embedded feature will take those outputs, it will parse them into JSON back to the embedded feature manager. It'll turn them into outputs, send them over the platform channel back to native. And then native has just gone through a system where I just started this feature, and then I have no idea what's going on, but at some point I get a message back saying, hey, this thing's done. And at the end of the day, the way that adding this X feature works in Flutter is going to be pretty much the same way it works in native. If you can have a structure like this in place that takes care of a lot of the complexity for you, if you can make it so that it's the same widget that's being pushed as a route, then it will be really easy to, at the end of everything, delete this and end up with a widget tree that works the way you expect it to. So that way, you come from having, starting in native and going to native with native and Flutter on top of it, to native hosting a Flutter app with a big widget tree. Then eventually, you can kind of get rid of a bunch of the native stuff, the dependency injection, the logging, because you're not doing anything in native anymore. And that is when you have this kind of magical Flutter app moment that we are racing towards at Betterment. And currently, I think where we stand is something like this, where we have like just a handful of things. Again, they are kind of some of the more complex things, which is really fun. It's a really fun challenge now to deal with some of the life cycle specific platform complexities and start to put those in Flutter. But almost all of our app is in Flutter. Everything, most of the things that you do that you enjoy about the Betterment Flutter app are Flutter experiences. And that is essentially how we've done an incremental migration into Flutter at Betterment. This is, I'm Will Lockwood. If you have any questions, I'm going to open up for questions now, but if you have any other questions, you can either come up to me afterwards, you can find me on Twitter and DM me, and then again, if you want to come join us and help us get to the finish line that we've been racing towards, then I'd love to chat with you. I'm sure Justin and Caitlin would as well. So again, thank you all for being here, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Will. So who want to ask questions?
Hi, how much automated testing did you use in this process?
As in automated testing for
like as far as like doing your refactoring and building the features?
Yeah, so we've had a big push to make sure that we have as high code coverage as possible in terms of just regular application testing. But aside from the regular kind of testing that you would have as any kind of app, it's, I think, also really important to have testing of the system that you create that manages all this stuff as well. So we've focused a lot on that. I would definitely suggest that people do that as much as possible. One of the places that it's harder to do that is the place where Flutter becomes native. So over a method channel where you have things that are turned into JSON or coming from JSON, and you're going to take it and make it some other object that becomes a widget or something like that. That part, I think there are ways to do method channel testing. We have not actually done that, but our goal has been as soon as things are in Flutter world or as soon as things are in native world, make that as high code coverage as possible. It's been our priority, I think. Yes. So yeah, so the question was like kind of percentage wise, where are you in terms of things being in Flutter or native code? It's interesting. There are a couple of different ways I could respond to that. One would be like, in terms of user experience, we have some native features that still are alive and you could technically get to, but they represent really slim areas of how a user could get to a specific experience. So we have a couple of those still in native. They're pretty low priority since we don't iterate them on them very much. And then we have some stuff that is like right around the beginning of an app, which is like starting up the app in general, how to decide where if you're going to go to like the unauthenticated experience or the home experience, that kind of thing. That part we're still working to put into Flutter. But overall, in terms of like raw lines of code, we're definitely above, I'd say like 75% of the features. And the stuff that's left over is gonna be very, very fun. Okay, great. I can open that up. When developing a feature, does the developer have to deploy in the hybrid native Flutter engine app, or do you have a bootstrap/shell for doing pure Flutter development? That's a really, really great question. This is something I think that Jeremy mentioned really briefly. We have in development 2 ways that you can run the Betterment app. One is with it lacks some of the complexity of stuff like authentication or like it's a standalone mode that basically allows you to go to all of the Flutter features. It'll start you either in our home screen or in a launch pad that will be able to go to specific features. And that way you could just build the Flutter app. It's a completely different, iOS, I guess you would call it like a target or a run configuration. So we are able to do either. One thing I think is really important is if you're doing anything about a feature that like is being launched from native, then we try to make sure that we have people at some points doing development as if they're actually the user going from native to Flutter, going from Flutter to native, because there are platform specific things that can go wrong that are really important to figure out and catch in development. So having both of those available to us, I think has been important. And using both of them has helped us make sure that we don't put things that are just plainly broken into production. We have another one here. Did you migrate everything vertically? Example, are the network stack models all pure Dart now? What about cross-cutting services that multiple features would depend on? Another great question. So there are in Flutter, you might have, for example, logging or like crash reporting. Those things that are configured usually in main.dart before you actually render something, or in that, all of those kinds of things that would work the same way, things that handle feature flagging, et cetera. Those things we usually configure right at the beginning so that they are configured regardless of whether you're just starting like one feature in a largely native app, or if you are starting pretty much the entirety of an app that's going to be in Flutter and then is going to do some communication to native. So in terms of migrating things vertically, the network stack, in order to do any of the individual features, there were specific things that we might have to add in terms of complexity about what we're configuring. For example, one feature might necessitate using some new plugin. It might require that if you're going to migrate the authentication part of the app, it's going to require that you hook into some of the native specific stuff that your native app is doing. But I think that for a large part of our migration, we had a lot of that stuff set up. We have a great platform team that is focused on making that really easy for a lot of our developers. So hopefully that answers the question there.
Okay. Look like we don't have any questions. So thank you very much,
Thank
Will.
you again, everyone.
All right, guys, that wraps up our meetup. So thanks to our speakers and our host again tonight. All right, have a safe time getting home and stay tuned for our next meetup in January and February. Hope to see you there, okay? Have a good night. Thanks.